At number 10, we have an abandoned hospital that Hitler stayed in. Check out Beatlitz Hallstatten Hospital in Berlin. Located 30 kilometers outside Berlin, the huge hospital has been used as a place to treat tuberculosis, as well as transforming into a military hospital in both the World Wars. In 1916, Adolf Hitler was admitted to the hospital after being wounded in the Battle of the Somme. Later in World War II, it was exclusively used to treat Nazis. Now, a lot of people have been nursed back to health here, which is pretty concerning if you think about it, because it's not a place that I'd really want to spend where Nazis regained their life. I don't know. They say that the walls absorb history. Well, there's some pretty intense history that could have been absorbed into these walls. The hospital is vast too, seriously huge. While it is abandoned, it has been used as a film set on a couple of occasions. For example, it was used in the 2012 movie The Pianist.
At number 10, we have Glendale Hospital. Now, this hospital was one built in the 30s to help deal with the tuberculosis epidemic. The building was used in other ways as well until its closure in 1982 because of the high levels of asbestos in the building. Today, police patrol for trespassers, but that doesn't stop graffiti artists, curious teens, and ghost hunters from exploring the abandoned hospital. One local urban legend is that if you sneak inside the hospital, you will be chased by the ghosts of the patients who passed away in the building. A local resident said, "My friend went there and swears he saw a ghost watching him from the shadows. And after that, he won't go near that place anymore." Also, a group that went in to explore heard whispered responses to their questions through EVP, and they also heard thuds and bells. Lastly, they caught light anomalies on camera, and they said they couldn't really debunk them as being dust or bugs.
Starting us off with number 10 is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Located in West Virginia, the beautiful estate opened up in 1863 and was originally meant to house 250 people, but ended up housing close to 2,500. The asylum was problematic from day one. I mean, it had a separate wing just for black people. Either way, by 1881 it was disastrous. The hospital was infested with patients, rooms meant for one now housed 4 or 5 people, and the farm and dairy couldn't even meet the demand of so many people, and patients soon began to starve and their mental conditions declined. Patients were uncontrollable, they wouldn't listen to the staff. Most wild patients were actually locked up in cages to save space and just save the staff. When investigating the hospital, a reporter found a body cooler open with a body inside. They found patients sleeping on the floor and freezing due to lack of heat. Sanitation was at an all-time low, and by the time the place closed, its cemetery had been expanded to 666 acres to make space for all the dying people. When visitors go there now, they can feel the rage, they can feel the bad energy in the air. The asylum was abandoned and nothing was removed from the inside, so it looks exactly as it did when all this was going on. Ripped wallpaper from the patients, visitors have even seen the wallpaper peeling off in front of their eyes. Screams and howls from different wings of the building, cages rattling like someone was taking their anger out on them. It was a lot. It is a lot.
Starting off this countdown, we have Rolling Hills Asylum. Established in 1827, the Rolling Hills Asylum was originally a working farm that was converted into a home for the less fortunate. Then it went on to be a place for widows, orphans, alcoholics, criminals, and individuals with mental illnesses. But it closed its doors in 1974. Apparently, it's said that over 1,700 people died there. Hundreds are currently buried all over the property in unmarked graves, which makes this place very haunted. Visitors claim to have heard screaming and doors slamming. Others have seen the apparition of Roy Cruz, a 7.5-foot tall man who died there in 1942. And the hospital even has something known as a shadow hallway. A hallway where you can see tons of ghostly apparitions.
Starting us off at number 10 is the Arradale Mental Hospital. This is an Australian psychiatric hospital. Patients got there in 1865 and it was closed in 1998. Electroconvulsive therapy and transorbital lobotomies were common practice, which not even children were excluded from. It was explored by John and Deb Christopher of the Drifter Paranormal Investigative Team, and they experienced a lot they couldn't explain. They went in with a ton of equipment and they encountered what they believed to be a friendly child ghost, or specter, that set off their K2 EMF meters in sequence. It was as if the ghost was running past them. Now, they said the feeling in that room was lovely, like a playing feeling because of the ghosts or spirits that were there, but that was their nicest encounter of the time there. They heard other sounds and wheezing, whistling noises, and the sound of furniture being dragged, but As John said, there is no bloody furniture there. So the pair physically saw some cell doors moving and other things, and got a bit of a creepy feeling. And they said yes, it was a windy night, so maybe that could be the doors, but they were in the middle of the building and hadn't noticed any drafts. So if you want to test out that location yourself, there are paranormal tours on most weekends, so maybe give it a try.
Coming in at number 10, in Germany, legend has it that there is an abandoned hospital overrun by zombies. The Kinderkrankenhaus on the outskirts of Berlin is pretty terrifying, A, because it's an abandoned children's hospital, and B, because it might be infested by brain-sucking zombies. From the outside, the building in the woods has been battered by the elements, but on the inside, well, who knows. Urban legend has it in the nearby town that the old abandoned hospital is home to a number of zombies waiting to strike. Those who dare visit the location have taken some terrifying pictures of the interior and exterior, although I haven't seen any zombies. My question is, are they regular zombies or are they child zombies? Either way, ugh.
Coming in at number 9 is the Bloodbath. Now this one is gruesome and shared by a user called Paravel. So they shared that they were working their regular night shift in a bone marrow transplant unit with another nurse. They had 5 patients, and as the other nurse was coming out of room 4, she shared that the patient in there had died a very gruesome death. He was slated and approved to go home, but that same night, the nurses heard the sound of someone falling. They went in to check on him and saw nothing but blood. The man had pulled out his own central line and there was blood everywhere, like it was a bloodbath, Game of Thrones a red wedding style. He died right there and then, and no one knew why he did it. He was literally free to go. But get this, a few weeks later, a little old lady gets moved into that same room and she asks if anyone had died in there. The nurse brushed it off, saying people die in the hospital all the time, but the old lady replied by saying, no, I think a young guy died in here because he's talking to me right now. Now this woman also has a central line, and later that night the nurse goes in to check on her. Again, an utter bloodbath. Her central line had been cut. Not pulled like the other guy, it was proper cut. There was no scissors in the room and all the lady said was he did it. Right, enough of that.
Starting us off at number 10 is Underwater. Jade Raven on Reddit wrote about a 9-year-old that was in child psych as an acute inpatient. The reason? The mother of the child refused to allow them to have another lollipop, and his response was far from normal. He calmly and purposefully drowned a toddler. The Redditor wrote that there was no spark of anything in that 9-year-old's eyes. No life, no humanity, it was stark cold, terrifying. So basically, an emotionally attached toddler felt detached from the actions that sent another kid to their end.
Starting off this countdown, we have the teeth. The first patient on this list did something so gruesome to herself that you may just want to stop eating for a second while I tell the story. So according to the nurse that shared this story, this patient was known for inflicting harm on herself. She was known to rip out all of her hair till there was none left on her head or body. That was one of her habits. One day when they went to go check up on her, they found her with blood all over the floor and blood coming out of her mouth. The patient had pulled out most of her teeth, some of which she actually swallowed. The image of her just sitting in her room, bloody teeth surrounding her, has haunted the nurse ever since.
In at number 9, we have Denbigh Asylum. Denbigh Asylum is a former psychiatric institute in North Wales. Now, over 1,500 patients were lobotomised on the grounds between 1848 and 1995. Not only that, Welsh MP George Maitland Lloyd took his life in the asylum in 1949. Urban explorer and filmmaker Lee Riley shot an incredible piece of footage on a DJI Phantom 4 drone flying over the old abandoned building. It's kind of hauntingly beautiful. Lee also ventured inside and took some photos of the crumbling building. Talking about his urban exploration, Lee said the building just sits there. He said it's weird to see how nature is just taking over. It's sad in some ways, but I feel proud to be one of the few people to see the places in their current state.
On to number 9, Old Toole Hospital. This is also known as Asylum 49 because this old home for nursing and other things also is part-time an attraction. Nurses that used to work there claim that 3 different ghosts lived there as well. A nurse in white, a man in black, and a little girl. The nurse in white became known when nurses would visit patients who said they had already been visited by a nurse in white already, but there was no nurse that wore white at the nursing home. Next, the man in black was said to be a terrifying apparition that manifested at 3 in the morning. And lastly, there was a little girl that would show up when patients were soon to die. Children's laughter could be heard in the halls, and that tended to be a sign that patients would pass away soon. This pattern of 3 mirrors the rumor that patients died in groups of 3 at the now abandoned hospital. So, while ghost tours are available, be warned. The spirits there are said to scratch visitors or even call out to them by name. Number 8. Seaside Sanatorium. This fortress made of brick was designed in 1934 by architect Cass Gilbert. I mention this because it used Tudor Revival architecture, essentially massive terraces facing the sea that wrap around the main building, aiming to help get children that were there get more sun. As I mentioned before, that was a main method of treatment for TB at one point. Now, once treatments for TB improved, the use of the building changed. After being a sanatorium, it was a home for the elderly, and then a traditional medical hospital, and then lastly, a hospital for intellectually disabled people. Sadly, in its final form, the hospital staff were frequently accused of abusing patients, and the hospital became known for its high mortality rate. It closed in 1996. Now, the abandoned hospital is home to persistent rumors of paranormal activity. Teams that have investigated have caught different EVPs of children's laughter or spirit orb photographs. Some claim to see objects moving of their own accord or swing sets that appear to be in use when no one's on them.
Coming in at number 9 is Old Changi Hospital. Now this one just legit looks like the set of the horror movie from my nightmares. Crumbling corridors, peeling wallpaper. The abandoned hospital located in Singapore was built way back in 1935. It was used for the British ARF, and when they withdrew 7 years later, the Japanese used it as a prison camp for British soldiers and anyone they deemed to be anti-Japanese. It's said the Japanese secret police had their base there and were known to be ruthless. Many prisoners were tortured tirelessly till they died. Some say they used to impale the severed heads of prisoners on stakes and put them out in public. It was bought in 2006 to be turned into a resort, but that fell through. Some say it was because of financial troubles, while others blame it on the hauntings. Visitors have heard screaming on the property and seen shadow people during the night and day. Some have even seen the apparitions of bloody soldiers walking through the hall, and the creepiest one for me by far is the ghost of a little boy that just sits and stares into the distance. A movie was shot in the hospital, and the cast and crew said they heard loud noises and voices and saw a floating woman with a black aura. Groups that go in there tend to have a member disappear, and when they reappear, they all tell the same story. They were following another member away from the group to a desolate part of the hospital when a figure would come and tell them they should never return. Upon exiting the hospital, that member would just disappear completely. I'm getting cringes, I'm getting goosebumps.
Moving on to number 9, we have Topeka State Hospital. The Topeka State Hospital, located in Kansas, operated from 1872 to 1997. And this hospital, much like the others on this list, has quite a dark history. So apparently in the early 20th century, a reporter visited the facility and witnessed some terrifying things. He said that he saw a patient that had been strapped down for so long that his skin was growing over the restraints, and there were other patients that were chained up like animals. But a majority of them just sat in the hallways on a rocking chair, rocking back and forth, staring at the walls all day. That's something straight out of a horror film.
At number 9 is another Australian asylum, Beechworth Lunatic Asylum. So we have talked about this place before, but that's because it's worthy of so many of our lists. A lot goes on there. It's haunted by many ghosts, including a specter that people have seen lying on the ground below a window. That woman specter was pushed out the window because another patient wanted her cigarettes. Now, one of the scariest sections of this asylum is the area that practice electroshock therapy. Visitors of the area today say that area is colder than others. Now, this could be because of the haunting idea of the practices that occurred there, or it could be because the ghosts of the people who died in the asylum linger there in hopes of escaping their past pain. Other visitors have heard sounds of children laughing and playing, and one woman went with her son and saw him talking to himself. Her son said he was talking to a boy named James who lived in the asylum, but there was no one there. Little unsettling, but hopefully it was a nice conversation, you know? Hopefully.
Coming in at number 9, we have the Killed by Death legend. Killed by Death is an urban legend that focuses on sick kids in a children's hospital. Children are admitted to the hospital with severe flu-like symptoms and see a creepy, nightmarish monster stalking the corridors at night. Those still ill with the flu are taken one by one at night by Kinderstod, which means child's death in German. The Kinderstod sucks out the kids' souls, leaving them to die prematurely, although doctors think it was their just a weak immune systems killing them. only people with the flu can see the monster, leaving healthy people to think the kids are delirious when they complain of seeing the beast. It turns out that while this creepy child-killing monster seems like the stuff of urban legends, after some digging I found out it was actually an adapted creepypasta from a 1998 episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Thought it sounded pretty familiar.
Next at number 8, we have False Hope. This one comes from an ER nurse who spoke from a now deleted account on Reddit. She had an old lady stay in the ER overnight that was near death. They saw the signs: irregular breath, barely responsive, pale and cool, so they turned the lights down and kept an eye on her monitor. They searched and couldn't find any family, and then on top of that, she was a DNR, do not resuscitate. So the writer says they were basically waiting for her to die. She was close. And then, an hour later, all of a sudden, she's standing at the door of her room with all of her clothes back on, just there. Apparently, she was hungry, so they got her food, and while she ate, the old woman talked to the staff a little bit in her room, but then she told her nurse she was tired and wanted to lie back down. Within 30 minutes, she was dead. This surge of energy is called rallying before death, and it's not uncommon, but it's super unnerving, just like this Redditor said, and it's just unnerving to see so much life in a person before death. Scary. Next at number 9 is Porphyria. So Deviana Morgan on Reddit shared her mother's experience since her mother had worked in mental institutions previously. She even worked at a large and well-known asylum before it shut down apparently. One patient where she worked was a woman who thought she was something like a vampire. Because of this, she was limited to being allowed out only 1 hour per day. And even during this time, they had used safety precautions because she already killed at least one worker at the hospital before they made these changes. When she asked for more information about the patient, she was told by the others that the patient had killed at least 2 of her children. She also wounded another and her husband. The explanation she received was that the patient had a physical condition called pyphyria that made her crave blood.
And at number 9 we have the appetite. So this next patient was placed into a hospital after suffering severe brain damage. She was so bad that she would tend to eat anything around her. She has eaten styrofoam cups, plastic cutlery, plates, and even her clothes. As a result, she was kept in a padded cell with absolutely nothing in it, or else she would try to eat it. One night though, she plucked out one of her eyes. When nurses found her, they wondered where the eye had went. But I'm sure you know where this is going. They later found that she had eaten her own eyeball. This isn't fake, guys. These are real stories.
Coming into number 8, we have Britain's largest lunatic asylum. Hellingly Hospital has been abandoned for 18 years. Sitting in the Sussex countryside near the village of Hellingly, the building has fallen into disrepair. Now, the main hall has a theatre-like vibe with some spooky high ceilings. Some of the old equipment is still in the building too, like this patient's chair for example. I can imagine someone laying in that chair while a doctor prodded and poked them with utensils. The fact that the chair can still be found in the building is pretty chilling.
On to number 7, the McRaven House. So this one was built way back in 1797 in Mississippi, and the McRaven House has been called a time capsule of the South. There were expansions to the house in 1836 and 1849, but each edition left the initial construction untouched. So this house makes our list because it was a Confederate field hospital during the Civil War, and several residents passed away within the home. The former owner of the residence, John Bob, was murdered just outside the premises. But the most active spirit that haunts the house is said to be Mary Elizabeth Howard. She was originally the lady of the house. She died in 1836 shortly after giving birth in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Her presence is rumored to be behind a bedside lamp in her old room turning on and off, unexpectedly and just any time.
At number 8 we have Beechworth Asylum. Located in Victoria, Beechworth was surrounded by 106 hectares of farmland, making it self-sufficient for one, but also extremely isolated for two. And it was very easy to get put into Beechworth. All it literally took was a signature from a doctor saying you were unstable, and in you went, my friend. If you went in there, chances are you stayed in there till you died. Only a third of the patients actually ended up getting out. Physicians who worked at the hospital always spoke about brutal treatments, very troubled patients, and no hope of escape for anyone. It opened in 1867, and during its 128 years of being open, around 9,000 patients died on the property. Treatments involved isolation cages, straitjackets, restraint chairs, lobotomies, and electroshock treatments. People who go there have seen the ghost of a young girl who tries to communicate with you in any and all means possible. They've seen the ghost of Nurse Matron Sharp in the halls as well. But the Gravilla wing, where the electroshock therapy took place, is especially creepy. Visitors report feeling feeling icy cold in that area, and that a woman was pushed out of a window in that ward because another patient wanted her cigarettes. People have reported seeing her body on the ground where it fell all those years ago. Others have heard children laughing. One visitor's son was found talking to himself, and when asked who he was talking to, he said James, a little boy that lives at the asylum.
In our 8th spot, we have the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum began operating in 1964 and was designed to only hold 250 patients. However, it was soon housing more than 2,400 patients, which was very problematic. The place was extremely overcrowded, and patients started to become more and more violent. Soon, they were starting fires and attacking the staff. In 1994, the asylum was forced to close due to a lot of violations. Now it's said that the building is haunted from the souls of the mistreated patients. In fact, the building is open to ghost tours if you want to go do some exploring.
On to number 8. Poole Park in Wales. Now, this building in Wales was used for many different things, but one use was an asylum. The Gothic-inspired architecture only adds to the creepy effect this abandoned building has. And while it may transition into another building, that hasn't stopped many from exploring its sites while they can. Jason Griffiths, of a group called the Ouija Brothers, saw his friend attacked by an aggressive spirit and possibly even possessed here. He wasn't even surprised at the time. He said, "There's a very dark, heavy presence at Poole Park, and if you don't listen to it and pay it attention, it makes itself known. You can feel when he's near, the surrounding energy becomes heavy." Now, it's a very active site in terms of the unknown and paranormal, with people having their shirts tugged by mysterious forces, to seeing figures in windows of empty rooms.
Coming into number 8, we have the Red Wristbands urban legend. The wristband story is a creepypasta about a doctor who sees dead people. Basically, the story goes that Dr. Ullman was working as a surgeon and unfortunately couldn't save the life of one of his patients. As a signifier that the patient was dead, Dr. Ullman placed a red wristband on the deceased. After cleaning up and taking a moment, Dr. Ullman hopped into the hospital elevator to take a break in the cafeteria. As he was heading downstairs, a woman in a hospital white gown hopped in after him. Ever the gent, Ullman asked what floor the woman was heading to. She said she was expected in the morgue. Baffled, Dr. Ullman noticed another patient trying to jump in the elevator, but unfortunately they missed as the doors closed in his face. Ullman locked eyes with the man before the doors shut. He went white, he thought he'd seen a ghost. The lady asked what was wrong. He said that he thought that the man was a patient who had just died. The woman asked how he could be sure, and Dr. Ullman said that he was wearing a red wristband. The woman then smiled, held up her arm and said, "Like this one?" The elevator went down.
Now at number 7 is Speak Back to Me. Now this story comes from a travel nurse called Courtney, and if you don't know what a travel nurse is, it's basically a nurse that travels across the country and works at a new hospital every 13 weeks. Now Courtney shared that she was working at an ICU at the time, and she had a patient there that would only repeat what was said to her and say nothing else. Now that day Courtney was with her all night, and she started telling her all the ways she had apparently died, saying things like, "I died because I took too much insulin, I died because of narcotic overdose, I died on a sunny Sunday afternoon," and so on. Now Courtney kind of brushed it all off as the patient was troubled, but then she looked up at the ceiling and said, "They're all still here." At that point Courtney was like, "I'm gonna up the hell out of here," and ran out of the room. If that was me, I'd be like, "Medicate, honey. I'm not here to be hearing you talk about the ghosts of deaths past. I'm here to do my job and then leave." She further shared that once she was caring for a blind patient who continuously asked her what time it was all night. She left and came back a while later to check in on her, and all the patient said was, "It's the witching hour." Court looked at the time, saw it was 3:33 AM and walked out, and hopefully never returned, because I sure damn would have not.
Next at number 8 is With Bare Hands. So Never Got Challenger was another Redditor that's mom was a nurse. During her mom's time in the neuropsychiatric ward while in grad school, she had one terrifying experience that stuck with her. It happened during a routine room check on night shift. All the patient's doors should have been closed, but after rounding a corner she saw an open door, and on the floor were a staff member's legs sticking out. When she got to the room she saw why the staff member was downed. The patient in the room was a woman with severe postpartum psychiatric disorder, and she had gouged out both of her eyes with her bare hands. She was just sitting there, cross-legged, holding her eyes in her palms. The first staff member to find her like that had a heart attack, and the mother who told this story said she performed CPR on the downed staff member. And while she did that, the patient just sat calmly, holding her eyes.
Coming in at number 8, we have Jane. According to this person that shared the story, Jane was a young lady that had a lot going on, but she wasn't diagnosed yet. The first night at the facility, the staff found Jane in her room in a puddle of blood. Turns out that Jane was picking at the skin on her legs. She managed to pull her skin up on her leg and was degloving her own calf. Jane also had other strange habits. Every night before bed, she would perform the same ritual. She would run from wall to wall, touching them in a crucifix pattern. She would do this for hours before finally going to bed. But one night, a worker heard Jane screaming late at night. When he went to go check in on her, she was standing at the doorway smiling. When the staff said, "Jane, what's wrong?" she replied with, "What makes you think you're speaking to Jane?" "Yeah, no, that's possession. Jane is gone. That's the devil you're talking to."
Coming in at number 7, this next hospital is also in Berlin and is rumoured to be haunted by zombies. This hospital was also a children's hospital, which makes things even creepier. The facility was called Kinderkrankenhaus, which to the English tongue makes it seem even scarier. These days the building in the woods has been battered by the elements and ransacked by vandals. Urban legend in the nearby town is that the old abandoned hospital is home to a number of zombies waiting to strike. Those who dare visit the location have taken some terrifying pictures of the interior and exterior. On the flip side though, some of the graffiti is pretty cool.
Number 6, Rock Haven Sanitarium. This sanitarium opened in the 1920s and was one of the first to try kinder alternatives to the treatments that were given at the time. It was a woman's only asylum during a time when men could plead a woman's insanity during a divorce with little to no evidence. Obviously, a lot of people were sent to different asylums that were using much worse treatments, but those two reasons made this asylum very ahead of its time. So Rock Haven was bought by the city of Glendale in 2008, but it is essentially abandoned. Those who guard or take care of the property have reported unusual encounters though. They say they have seen lights switching on, clocks changing time, figures passing in front of windows, disembodied voices, knocking on the walls, and items appearing out of nowhere. The biggest item that has appeared out of nowhere is, amazingly, a piano. Before then, it was only seen in vintage photographs, but then there. One local historian gives tours of the property every once in a while, and he says that the hauntings are borderline pleasant. Must have been because it was a nicer asylum. Haunted though, nonetheless.
Filling at number 7 slot is the Athens Lunatic Asylum. Contrary to popular belief, this one is located in Ohio, not Athens, Greece. It opened its doors in 1874 and housed violent criminals, children, war vets, etc. and performed lobotomies on the daily pretty much. It was known for lobotomies, and that is not a good look, my friend. A lot of employees were trained to do these kind of procedures, but a lot of them weren't. The asylum's first ever patient was a 12-year-old girl with epilepsy who was thought to be possessed by a demon. I'm so glad our mental health knowledge has developed this much that it doesn't happen anymore. Like, we can't have that. The asylum itself was beautiful, you know, it had gardens, livestock, a dairy. It was like a retirement home, not a hospital. All patient and staff information was kept strictly under wraps, and it stayed mysterious, like you can't even access any information about who was there unless you file paperwork with the state of Ohio. 1,930 people were buried on the property, but if you thought you could find out their identities that way, you're wrong. Each headstone is simply marked with a number and nothing else. Rumors of staff killing patients were rife because of that, and these rumors weren't helped by the fact that in 1978 a female patient disappeared only to be found dead in an abandoned ward ages later. Even till this day you can see the stain on the ground where her corpse was. I feel like I'm gonna be making this face after every story.
In our 7th spot, we have the Metropolitan State Hospital. Located in Massachusetts, this hospital opened in 1930 for patients with mental illnesses. But in 1980, something sinister happened that gave the hospital the nickname the Hospital of Seven Teeth. So back in 1978, a patient named Anna Marie Davy went out for a walk on the grounds, but she never returned. In 1980, the patient Melvin Wilson came forward saying that he had killed her and buried her body parts all around the grounds. Not only that, he kept 7 of her teeth as souvenirs. Hence the nickname, the Hospital of Seven Teeth. But that's not the only bad thing to happen there. Years before this incident, in the 1960s, a bunch of patients were accidentally poisoned, but this has never been confirmed. In 1992, the hospital was closed after psychiatric care in Massachusetts became more privatized.
At number 7 is Eloise Hospital. In its busy days, over 12,000 patients lived there. It was nearly its own city, pretty much. It had a lot to provide for them. Now, when people have explored it nowadays, they have heard moans, roars, and screams on the grounds of the old psychiatric hospital. An employee reported that children saw a figure he couldn't see, and that the buildings had strange shadows. The basement of this building is especially creepy as it was flooded by water for many years and wasn't explored for a very long time. When it was explored by a group called Detroit Paranormal Expeditions, they described their experience as eerie. They heard shuffling noises as if some of the old resident spirits remained, and although it undergoes transformation into a mixed-use residential complex, it is assumed that the spirits haunting the area still remain and their emotional energies are lingering there.
Coming in at number 7, we have the popular real-life urban legend that you should never go to a hospital at the beginning of a fiscal year because you'll get hurt. Ooh, fiscal year, talk sexy to me, top 10 list. Love me a fiscal year. Seriously though, this is actually an urban legend. People think that if they go to a hospital, particularly like a training hospital, they're likely to suffer an injury at the hands of doctors. Why? Because the new fiscal year marks a new intake of junior doctors who are inexperienced. While there is some slight evidence to back this up, healthcare providers insist that this is just an urban legend. Coming into number 6, we have babies switched at birth. We've all heard the urban legend of 2 babies born in the same hospital getting switched at birth, right? They're then brought up by the wrong families, and on their 18th birthday they find out they were actually switched. It's a classic. There's even a TV series about it on ABC. This is actually what happens sometimes though, guys. How scary would it be to realize that you were actually from a whole other family entirely, and you could have had a very different life? Now this happened to Doris Grudenwald, born in 1990. 27 years later, following routine blood tests, she found out that she'd been given to the wrong family. Speaking to local news outlets, she said, "My whole body started shaking. It was like the ground under my feet disappeared." The woman from Australia took university hospital grads to court, and the medical facility were ordered to pay 90,000 euros in damages. Honestly, I don't feel like that's enough though.
Alright, on to number 6, A Shriek and a Goat Man. Now, this isn't the shrieking goat like that Taylor Swift cover. This is a story that comes from the mother of Danger Moose, or Danger M-U-U-S, on Reddit. She was on night shift, the mother, in a hospital in Arizona going room to room when an old lady told her about a goat man trying to get through the doors. This woman was an insomniac, so the mother didn't think anything of it. Then, a blood-curdling shriek rang out that people heard all around the hospital. People were freaked out, and then a few looked out the windows where they found hoof marks by the doors and windows, with no trails leading to or from them. That insomniac clearly knew something was up, and it must have been the goat man causing that shriek, right? Either himself or through nefarious means? Like, on to number 7, we have slicing. This story comes from Huge Pianist on Reddit who worked at a facility. The hospital had a young woman in their custody with a number of issues. On her first night, she was found during a routine check laying in a puddle of her own blood. She had been slicing the skin around her shin with her fingernails and was in the process of pulling her skin up her leg. Try not to picture it. She also had a nightly ritual. She ran between walls in her rooms and touched them in a crucifix pattern. It would go on for hours until she sat on her bed and went to sleep. There was one night though when her running was more frantic. She was screaming in her room late into the night. The staff went to check on her and reported that she stood in the doorway with a smile. The staff asked what was wrong, and Jane replied, "What makes you think you were speaking to Jane?" Creepy.
In our 7th spot, we have The Threat. Honestly, if I worked at any of these places, I don't think I would ever sleep again, especially after hearing this next story. So this next individual worked at a hospital, particularly with older patients. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and the staff was going around making sure all the patients were still in their rooms sleeping. But when they approached the room of an 83-year-old woman, they found her sitting straight up in her bed, just staring at the wall. They walked into the room and told her to lie back down and to go to sleep. Then she turned around and said, "They're coming for you, dear." Then she started laughing, like she let out an evil cackle. Afterwards, she lied back down and said, "I'm going to miss you when they take you." Yeah, I wouldn't sleep anymore if that happened to me. Sleep? Yeah, we don't know her.
Coming into number 6, we have Kings Park Psychiatric Hospital in New York City. Kings Park is on Long Island, and it opened in the late 1800s. At the time it opened its doors as an asylum, it was the largest state-funded mental institute. The facility came complete with railroads to bring in supplies. The facility expanded and eventually suffered from overcrowding in the 1950s. By the mid-1990s, it had run out of money and was closed down. While people can explore portions of the grounds, the buildings are kept away from the public eye. Now that hasn't stopped urban explorers gaining a glimpse though, and I have to say it looks really terrifying. Like most scary abandoned hospitals, it's surrounded by woodland, and I can just imagine patients running through the trees trying to escape. YouTube channel Vocative made a whole video about this place and you should check it out. Also, here are a few pictures from the inside. I think the paintings on the wall are especially scary. I'm not talking about the graffiti, I'm talking about the kind of absurdist ones at the back. Like, what is going on there?
On to number 5, St. Ignatius Hospital. The St. Ignatius Hospital operated from 1893 to 1964. It was a private hospital that struggled financially until it closed down. It was sold in 1968 and used as an assisted living facility. It was officially shut down and abandoned in 2000. Today, it is said that the ghosts of the former patients have reclaimed the halls of the hospital. One of the main ghosts is believed to be F.E. Martin, the hospital's first fatality. He unfortunately died after being crushed between 2 railroad cars. People who dare to visit have reported hearing strange growls and being attacked by unseen hands.
Now at number 6 is Taunton State Hospital. This type of hospital was kind of like a self-contained city, and honestly the architecture was gorgeous. It looks like the estate of a very wealthy British man that wears a monocle. It was meant to give patients a chance at occupational therapies, let them have fresh air instead of isolating them in dark small rooms. Built in 1854, the psychiatric hospital has a very colourful history. They used to do frontal lobotomies often. In the 1870s, they used to put patients in water tanks and then put them in extreme cold to try and shock them out of their ailment. Later on, electric shock therapy was used on thousands of patients. Jane Toppin, a sociopathic serial killer, was one of its most infamous patients. And if you don't know who Jane is, she confessed to killing at least 31 patients while working as a nurse. Fantastic. And it said staff at the hospital used to conduct satanic rituals in the basement. They used to take patients down there and they were never seen again. Most of the buildings closed down by 1978 and became a mental health facility for convicted juveniles, but 97% of staff said the conditions of the hospital put everyone at risk. They didn't go into what they meant by conditions. Did they mean the decrepitness of it all? Did they mean the hauntings? Staff later came out saying they always felt uneasy on the property, especially if they went near the basement. One was even driving back there at night and saw screaming patients in the windows that weren't there.
In our 6th spot, we have Rancho Los Amigos. In 1888, Rancho Los Amigos, located close to downtown LA, was originally created to assist people living in poverty. Over time, the hospital expanded and was home to the elderly, homeless, and individuals with disabilities. But over the years, it ended up changing to become mainly a mental hospital. The hospital was in full operation until the 1950s, when it started to shut down its wards, including the mental hospital. That's when they discovered the hospital had a more dark past. In 2006, after the hospital was abandoned, a freezer was discovered in the morgue. Inside of it were mummified, amputated limbs, and brain tissue samples. Guess they didn't want to take that with them. But this makes you wonder what really went down in this hospital. The original building is now abandoned, but it has moved to another location and is now called Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center.
Let's move on to number 6, Namela Sanatorium in Finland. Now, this was built as a tuberculosis sanatorium and was replaced with a mental hospital in 1932. The mental hospital was shut down in 1989, and since then, local rumors have spread of sightings in the hospital. The local lore talks about 2 different legends in addition to mysterious lights showing up in the building. The first legend is that the hospital is haunted by a spirit of a young girl who died there. She causes cold drafts, lights to flicker, and taps on the shoulders of people as if it's a playful game. Now, the second legend is that an apparition appears on the roof. It looks like a woman, and then she jumps off, causing onlookers to panic. But when they get to her to help, she's disappeared. But let's not hold on any longer.
Okay, so this is a crazy story at number 5. We have toxic blood infecting a hospital. On a cold February evening in 1994, a 31-year-old woman, Gloria Ramirez, visited a hospital in Riverside, California. The woman was ill and had previously been diagnosed with cervical cancer. Now, the woman had some very unusual symptoms. Her heart was beating rapidly, her blood pressure was plummeting, and she was taking slow, shallow breaths. She was injected with Valium and other drugs to sedate her. odor. When she was stripped of her clothes, doctors noticed that her body was covered in an oily sheen and there was a garlicky odor coming from her mouth. When her blood was taken, doctors noticed that it smelled very strongly of ammonia. The medics who had taken her blood soon became queasy and then fainted. One stopped breathing for several minutes and another shook uncontrollably, losing the feeling in their limbs. It seems that Ramirez was releasing a toxicity. 23 of the 37 emergency room staff members on shift that evening experienced symptoms. Now 5 of them were hospitalized and 1 spent 2 weeks in intensive care. Ramirez died that evening and there was no official explanation from Livermore investigators about the bouts of illness on the ward that night. Weirdly enough, this urban legend does actually seem to be true. There are news articles about the incident.
Filling our number 5 slot is the hallucination. Now this one's from Reddit user Whites42 who worked as an ICU nurse. She shared that a woman in her 20s had come in with serious cardiac abnormalities and then abruptly went into respiratory distress. She was put on a ventilator and was sedated just enough to keep her lucid. She could nod to answer questions and that's all they really needed from her at the time. Now a few nights later, the patient in the room next to her has died, but the body was yet to be taken to the morgue. Now the girl's room door was closed and the male patient's curtain was drawn, so they never met nor did they see each other. The nurse went to check in on the woman and she looked like she was about to die, like she was in pure panic mode, and the nurse asked her if she was cold, were you in pain, are you warm, and she said no to everything. She then asked if she saw something and she started nodding aggressively. And mind you, just because she was sedated that doesn't mean she was hallucinating, like she wasn't. She started probing and asking questions to try and figure out what she was seeing, and she found out that the patient was seeing a Caucasian bald man missing his left arm. The nurse then freaked out when she realized the patient was seeing the ghost of the man who had died in the room next to her without ever actually seeing him. Okay.
On to number 6. Water cure. At the Topeka Asylum for the Insane in 1903, the attendants used torture under the direction of head staff. It was called a water cure against insane women at the asylum. Those who disobeyed Miss Houston, the head of staff, would have a sheet thrown over their head by attendants and be pulled down to the floor. Miss Houston would then pour water out of a pan onto the face in rapid succession until the patient obeyed orders. It was also known as simulated drowning and also sounds similar to waterboarding.
Moving on, number 6, we have the photos. So this story was posted on Reddit by the user Ping. She told the story on behalf of her sister, who is the director of a psychiatric hospital. According to her sister, one of her patients would cut open her arms, legs, and torso. But wait, it gets worse. After doing so, she would take photos of her family and place them under her skin and then close the skin around it. I seriously don't know how the workers do it. Like, I would be traumatized if I saw someone do that.
Another New York asylum up next. We have the Willard Asylum for the Chronically Insane at number 5. This is one of the creepiest places on earth. Operating from 1800 until 1995, rumors circulated that once people were admitted here, they would never be leaving. The average stay of a patient here was 30 years, which is actually longer than most life sentences, so that's pretty intense. It's also said that the people who died in the asylum were buried in nameless graves in the hospital grounds. As the hospital was closing down in 1995, an employee found 400 old suitcases stowed away in the loft, clearly packed away as if the person was never going to leave. The cases contained personal items and letters from family members, which is really sad if you think about how the patients weren't allowed to keep them. Some contained old photographs, which are really haunting to look at when you know that these people were admitted to the hospital and never allowed to leave.
We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Back in 1912, this hospital opened up in Queens, New York for individuals that were said to be mentally ill. Most of the patients had psychosis or schizophrenia. It started off as a small institution with only 32 patients, but in 1959 it housed more than 7,000 patients. As a result, the hospital was very crowded and understaffed. In the 1970s, rumors spread like wildfire about murders, attacks, and suicides all happening in the hospital. In fact, it's said that one nurse hit a patient in a straitjacket across the throat with a club, which ended up crushing his throat, and as a result he died from asphyxiation. Shortly after, later, the asylum was closed and left to rot.
Let's jump to number 5. We have Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Now this asylum opened up in 1864 and was built to house 250 people for treatment, but it swelled up to almost 2,400 people in the 1950s. The asylum even offered money to anyone who dropped off a patient, which obviously led to people who shouldn't have been admitted to be admitted. Now the spirits of the asylum range in their stories. There was a little girl named Lily who was born in the asylum, a man named Jesse who died of a heart attack in a bathtub, some Civil War stories, and one story of a patient who was brutally murdered by his roommates. Allegedly. Now, the ghosts in here are known to turn lights on and off, some like cigarettes, and this location is an asylum you can tour for yourself as they now charge for historical and paranormal tours. You can even stay overnight, but you can't sleep there.
This urban legend also turned out to be true. We have the story of Dr. Death at number 4. Dr. Death is the legend of a seemingly loving family doctor who would charm the elderly with his care. Secretly though, he was actually kinda evil, convincing the vulnerable OAPs to write him into their wills, and he would slowly kill them off with lethal drug combinations. When they died, he recorded their death as old age and would pocket their money. Now it sounds like a murderous creepypasta, but actually, it's true. In the late 90s in South Manchester, United Kingdom, Linda Reynolds of Donnybrook Surgery expressed concerns about the high mortality rate of Dr. Harold Shipman's patients. Police were alerted but unable to initially gather enough evidence. 6 months after the initial claims, police found sufficient evidence that Dr. Shipman was spiking his elderly patients with diamorphine and forging their wills. In total, Harold Shipman is thought to have killed over 215 patients between 1975 and 1998. 215. The majority of his victims were women, although he did kill some men. The majority of his victims were also usually over the age of 75. The youngest was in their 40s.
Moving on to number 5, we have What If. So a redditor that goes by Cromulent shared their story of a conversation they had with a man who was confined to a mental health facility. Cromulent said that even though the man was delusional, he was very smart as well. They were discussing how some people in mental institutions think the CIA or other agencies have put microchips in their head or other ideas. The man was arguing why the claim shouldn't be dismissed. He said, "It's precisely because such delusions are so common that mental patients make the best test subjects." And it's pretty accurate. The subjects are stuck in one place, constantly observed, and their concerns aren't taken seriously. How could someone know? Imagine being in a place where people trap you there for your own safety, and refusing their rules leads to more isolation. And then add onto that the idea that you can't trust your own thoughts. It's a scary place to be.
We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with The Biter. Reddit user OmniChronos shared the story of one of her patients. So she worked at a juvenile psych unit, and one of the patients she had was very suicidal and distraught. Because of this, she would tend to bite chunks of skin and flesh out of her own shoulder. She had to be placed in restraints and her head strapped back because of this. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Apparently 3 years later, she was on a bus headed to an interview for a graduate psych program. While on the bus, she was approached by a nicely dressed girl. The girl asked her if she worked at a psych unit. She then went on to say that she was the girl that used to bite the skin off of her shoulders. She was doing completely fine now. Like, that's amazing. I'm so happy that the girl is doing fine. Also, it's pretty cool how they just randomly bumped into each other like 3 years later.
This is really scary because several murders took place in this hospital. We have the Gabler Children's Center at Metropolitan State Hospital in Waltham, Massachusetts. This children's center was not a nice place to be. In a book written by Dina Williams on the topic of abandoned insane asylums, she reveals how the center was once amid a scandal of accidental poisoning. On top of that, the location has garnered the nickname of the Hospital of Seven Teeth due to a nasty murder in the 1970s. A patient named Anna Marie Davey was pounced upon and murdered by a fellow patient, a deranged man named Melvin Wilson. When police finally investigated him, they found that he had chopped up her body and hidden it in 3 separate graves. It seems that Wilson kept 3 of her teeth as a souvenir. The hospital closed in 1992. While some parts of it have been demolished, some scary abandoned buildings still remain, concealing the dark history. So, what is scarier than a creepy abandoned hospital?
At number 4, Central State Psychiatric Hospital. So this hospital originally opened in 1842 as Georgia State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum. It was the first public psychiatric hospital in Georgia. A century after it opened, it swelled to 200 buildings across 2,000 acres. At its peak, it housed up to 13,000 patients. The treatments of the time are appalling. Lobotomies, electroshock therapy, straitjackets, and even children being confined to cages were methods used at the hospital. With the large numbers it housed and the mass graves nearby, it is no wonder that people have had paranormal experiences there. People report voices or strange sightings close to the graves where over 25,000 people are buried. The sightings are typically said to be simple visual anomalies, but golfers from nearby have also reported hearing screams from within the abandoned buildings. Additionally, passerby have felt strange as they come near the buildings with feelings they can't really explain.
Coming in at number 5 is Nocton Hall. Located in England, during World War I it was used as a home for wounded American officers, but by World War II it was a military hospital. By 1957 it was open to the general public and closed down around 48 years later. However, things were bad, but not when it was a hospital, when it was a home. It's said the ghost of a young girl roams the hall and enjoys being in one bedroom in particular. Staff staying in that room used to get woken up at 4:30 AM every night by a young girl crying by their bed. She would say things like a devilish man had done this to her and other things like that. The story claims the ghost is a servant girl who became pregnant after being with the owner's son, and he then later murdered her. The apparition of a grey lady has also been seen around the hall, but God knows who the hell she is, but she's there.
Making our way down the list, number 4, we have the Ganjiam Psychiatric Hospital. This next abandoned hospital is named one of the most haunted places in South Korea, and one of the freakiest places in the world. In fact, it's home to tons of urban legends. One legend states that the owner of the hospital was insane and kept the patients as his prisoners. Another version of the legend states that patients at the hospital started dying mysteriously, and that's what forced the hospital to close. In reality, the hospital closed in the 90s due to unsanitary conditions and lack of funding. Apparently because of this, the owner left the country, leaving no documentation behind about this building, so it was just abandoned. But to this day, people are convinced that the hospital is haunted. In fact, thousands of people break into the hospital each year just for the chance to catch a ghost.
Let's move on to number 4, Bethlehem Royal Hospital, aka Bedlam Asylum. The term Bedlam, meaning a scene of uproar and confusion, or chaos, or madness, came from this place. Bethlehem, Bedlam. And it's understandable how the term came from this place once you look at its history. It used to be a psychiatric institution in London that began in the 1400s, way back, and patients were locked up in chains and the treatments used on them bordered on torture. The residents of the areas surrounding the hospital complained about the sounds of cryings, screechings, roarings, brawlings, shaking of chains, swearings, frettings, and chafings. So the ghosts don't just haunt the Royal Hospital, but also Liverpool Station, since the station was built over the cemetery of the facility back in 1874. In the late 18th century, screams were heard in the area, and back in 2000, a ghost was recorded on closed-circuit TV at the station. So the ghosts all over London at that point, just because of that one place. Total bedlam.
Coming into number 3, we have the Legend of Kingseat Psychiatric Hospital. You could literally not pay me to go here, like nothing, no money. This is an old abandoned mental asylum in New Zealand of all places. Staff were nasty to patients with many abuse claims and even murder claims coming from relatives of those admitted to the facility. Interestingly, despite many patients dying in their stay at Kingseat, it's said by locals that more staff members and nurses died than any of them. There are some suggestions that something in the place led people to suicide. Now the building is abandoned, which makes it even creepier. I have no idea why you would ever visit, but if you did, you can still see the scratch marks on the walls where patients tried to claw their way out of the rooms. That is not all you might find either. It seems that the building has been at the centre of paranormal investigations for years, with local legends saying that the building is haunted by as many as 100 ghosts. Most famously, the ghost of a grey-looking nurse is said to stalk the halls. Just get me away from there.
At number 4, followed by death. This comes from another deleted account on Reddit. A staff member at a skilled nursing facility was typically working in the Alzheimer's ward and had a troubling string of experiences. First, they heard someone shuffle behind them, and then they feel someone put a hand on their shoulder while they're in a linen closet. So when they turn around, they see no one there and the door is still closed, so it was a bit freaky. Then another lady began to complain to them for 2 weeks straight every night that a man was coming into her room at night. That being in the Alzheimer's ward, the author of this post didn't take it too seriously, saying they'd check in on her throughout the night. At the end of the 2 weeks of complaining, the staff member asked what the man looked like, just out of curiosity. The woman said, "He's real handsome and wears a black suit. Oh, he's right behind you now, honey," which justifiably freaked the writer of this story out. There was no one behind them. And as for the old lady, she died the next night in her sleep. So was the person in the suit death following them? Is that what they felt with their hand on the shoulder on the hand? I leave it to you. Next at number 4 is Inside. This one comes from Atheist Comic. There was a patient with severe brain damage that was kept locked in a padded cell naked. She wasn't given access to anything that she could put in her mouth. This is because she would try to eat it every single time. She would eat anything. The examples given were styrofoam cups, plastic cutlery, and plates. Then one time on a full moon, she snuck a plastic spoon from a tray on the way to the bathroom, and with it she plucked one of her eyes out. This was despite her restraints and attendants, and in the end, they found the eyeball in her stomach. As I said, she ate everything.
In our 4th spot, we have the lost identity. This story starts off with a pretty dark backstory. So this next individual worked at the dental clinic of a psychiatric hospital. One of the patients that she will never forget is a man named Terry. Here's where it gets dark. When Terry was young, he witnessed his sister get killed by their stepfather. As soon as this happened, Terry took on the personality of his sister. He was 100% convinced that he was her. As a result, he would often dress like her. Even now, as a grown man, he would wear little girls' clothing. He would also cut pictures out of little girls and attach them to a string in which he would wear around his neck, like a necklace. Even though the pictures of the girls were random and from magazines, he was convinced that they were his friends. Terry was never violent at all. He was just simply a boy who saw a tragic death at a young age that literally broke him. And that makes me so sad. Poor Terry.
A creepy abandoned mortuary, basically a hospital for the dead at number 3. This is absolutely disgusting. Memorial Mound in Kentucky was left abandoned for 18 years with corpses left to rot inside. Caskets were disintegrating and bodies left in blue plastic bags. Weirdly, coffins were elevated off the ground and found left decomposing. Gross. Embalming liquids still remain in their tubs too, which is really weird. Some of the interior walls and fabrics appear to be moulding, which is also gross. The site was closed down in the year 2000 and was left abandoned since. Now the buildings, bodies and all, were rediscovered in 2014 and are now for sale. But I've got to ask, who on earth would want to buy this building? It is horrifying and more than likely totally haunted. What is worse than a creepy abandoned?
Number 3, Fairfield Hills State Hospital. This hospital opened in 1931 as a hospital to accommodate the overflow of patients from other nearby mental hospitals. Like other psychiatric hospitals we have talked about, the patients were treated harshly at the time. Until it was closed in 1995, the halls of the hospital were filled with stories of abuse, electroshock therapy, invasive experimental surgeries, suicides, and mysterious deaths. Eyewitnesses claim to have experienced hauntings within the walls. They have seen a dark, shadowy figure rounding corners quickly and have felt like they have eyes watching them. When they go to investigate, the figure had disappeared. Now the hospital is heavily guarded and trespassers are not welcome, so who knows what's going on inside.
At number 4 is the Ararat Lunatic Asylum. Said to be Australia's most haunted building, this mental institution is the largest abandoned asylum on the continent. It opened its doors in 1867 and 100 people died yearly, whether they were staff, patients, or prisoners. Now you're probably like, what do you mean prisoners? Ararat used to house the most criminally insane, evil people in the country, and it was also a place for people suffering from mental illness. It used to house around 1,000 patients and 500 staff members, and in the 130 years that it was open, there were around 13,000 deaths. These days, the asylum is used for ghost tours, and boy, oh boy, is this place haunted. Visitors have been known to faint unexpectedly, have waves of nausea and pain hit them out of nowhere, and methodical banging sounds can be heard everywhere, and it's most likely the sounds of patients hitting their heads against walls. I mean, the dead patients. But the J Ward is where it gets bad. The J Ward housed the asylum's most infamous patients like Bill Wallace. Bill shot his friend over a cigarette and then was declared insane. He died there after being held there for 67 years. Another one was Gary Webb, who mutilated himself 70 times and would say nothing but shout, "Get out." When guests go into J Ward, they feel like they're being shoved and bitten. The sound of ticking clocks, the desperate shrieking, the shouts of someone saying "get out." It's literally an invite to hell. Get out? Boy, you do not need to tell me twice. You don't even have to tell me once. You won't even find me in there. Filling our number 3 slot is Pennhurst State School and Hospital, previously known as the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. What a mouthful. The hospital opened its doors in 1908 and housed around 10,000 people and went through 79 years of controversy before officially shutting down. The campus was literally huge. It could have been a mini town on its own. It even had its own railroad. Patients sent there were seen as too unfit for citizenship, and the commission did not want them to intermix their genes with the general population. The hospital's chief physician believed every person in there could have been a potential criminal. The hospital's reputation declined rapidly when many residents came out saying they had been neglected and abused. 9 employees were charged for slapping and beating patients, many wheelchair bound, and forcing patients to assault each other. Patients would have unexplained bruises on them from the staff, and it was horrible. Nowadays, many of the buildings have been torn down, but paranormal activity is rife. Voices, footsteps, screams, abrupt temperature changes, wheelchairs moving on their own, items thrown out of nowhere. It's like the building and the spirits are just working together to show you how bad they used to have it. Audio recordings have picked up on voices saying things like "go away" and "I'll kill you" and "why won't you leave?" Need I say more? I don't think I need to.
In our third spot, we have the Zelda Fitzgerald Sanatorium. Built in 1859, this sanatorium, once called Tioranda, was originally built for the Civil War officer General Joseph Howland. Then in 1915 it was converted into a psychiatric hospital. In 1934, novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald took his wife Zelda there with hopes to cure her schizophrenia. Hence why people now refer to it as the Zelda Fitzgerald Sanatorium. However, it is probably most known for housing the patient Frances Seymour, aka actress Jane Fonda's mother. Frances ended up taking her own life there after cutting her throat with a razor in 1942. In 1999, the hospital closed and of course is now said to be haunted.
At number 3 is Ganjiam Psychiatric Hospital. Now, this hospital has so many legends that there's even a movie based on it. It's known as one of the most haunted places in South Korea. It was demolished in 2018, but that wasn't before many teams explored it after hearing all of the legends. It is said that it closed suddenly in the 90s due to an overwhelming amount of patient deaths. There were stories of mad doctors gone insane in doing experiments on the patients. The more logical reason that went around as a rumor to explain the closure was that it was no longer up to code. Either way, strange happenings were recorded by those who went there and explored. There were doors opening on their own, warnings not to go into room 402, glass shards being thrown across hallways, and demons scratching visitors. All of that, you name it. Now, Ganjiam didn't get its reputation for nothing. There are also rumors of shadows, voices, moans, and screams, but I guess that's typical in all the scary places. Not fun.
Coming in at number 2, we have the legend of the Russian sleep experiment. The Russian sleep experiment was a hospital experiment that was said to have taken place in Soviet Russia on political prisoners during World War II. Russian doctors were reportedly fascinated by the reason why people sleep, what would happen if people didn't, and the use of sleep deprivation as torture. Prisoners were told that they would be freed if they took place in a 30-day experiment. Allegedly, a special gas was used by medics to keep patients awake. For 5 days, patients were seemingly okay-ish, but after the 5-day mark they became increasingly paranoid and erratic. After 9 days they started screaming until they tore their vocal cords. The patients then began smearing their feces all over the room that they were in. After 14 days, the captives became very quiet and claimed that they no longer wanted to be free. In this time, one of the test subjects had passed away. When the gas was turned off that kept the guys from sleeping, the patients actually screamed that they wanted it back on. They did not want to go to sleep. Some of them had torn muscles and skin from their bodies, with some organs even being removed and thrown on the floor. Eventually the patients could no longer be described as human or even human looking. When asked what they were, one of the subjects smiled and said, "We are you. We're the madness that lurks within you, all begging to be free at every moment, your deepest animal minds. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go reputed nocturnal haven. Right, I mean this probably is just an urban legend, but honestly, who knows when it comes to war crimes committed by Soviet Russians.
At number 3 is the Grim Reaper. Now this one's from Redditor Scary Kerry 91476, and boy oh boy are you guys not ready for this one. So Kerry is an intensive care nurse, and she shared that back in 1999 she was in a 12-bedded ITU in London. She was in charge of the nurses station, and she looked up to see a man coming through the double doors of the unit, and that image just stuck in her mind even 20 years later. It was like he had been plucked out of 1974 and dropped into 1999. He was wearing cord pants, a check shirt with a patterned tank top on top, and platform shoes. He looked about 30 years old, and he just very calmly walked towards the bay of patients. Now Kerry had no idea who he was, so she asked him, and he responded by nodding and then just continued walking. Alright then. He went and stopped at the end of a patient's bed and just looked at them. He didn't touch them, there was no contact, he just made eye contact. The patient was sick but very stable, but as the man was looking at them, they suddenly started deteriorating in front of Kerry's eyes. Staff rushed over to assist him, and they were just acting like the man wasn't even there. And with that being said, he exited as calmly as he had come in. The patient ended up dying, and Kerry asked the assisting staff who the man was, and none of them had even seen him or remembered any man even walking in that day. So Kerry thoroughly believed that she saw the Grim Reaper at work that day. And Kerry, I bloody agree with you.
Next up at number 3, Hide the Knives. A tech in psych years ago shared their experience too. They met a 7-year-old kid who was sent there because the mother was afraid of her own son. She kept finding mutilated animals in their backyard, and neighbors' pets were disappearing. Also, the young boy hid knives around the house and then lied about it to his mom. Then, if they ever had an argument, the boy would get violent and threaten to kill his mother. She would also wake up to him standing beside her bed and staring at her, and so she set up locks on her bedroom door after that. She brought him in after she discovered over 50 knives hidden under his mattress. The people in the hospital described him as robotic in the way he talked. It was as if he was saying what he expected people were wanting to hear. He looked through people, not at them. The person who posted this story believes they met a 7-year-old psychopath.
Moving on to number 3, we have the carvings in the wall. This next worker was in charge of keeping an eye on a group of certain patients. One of the patients was a pretty shy guy named Tom. He had trouble speaking, so he often would just not speak at all. He had been in the hospital for about a month now and would often keep to himself. What's weird is that he would often sleep on the floor under his bed. Nurses just assumed he might be frightened and that he felt safer sleeping under his bed, so they allowed him to do so. One morning though, the nurse went to check on Tom and found him staring at the wall. His hands were covered in blood. Some of his fingernails were missing. They removed Tom from his room, and she inspected the room to see what went down. The nurse followed the trail of blood to under his bed. When she moved the bed, she was horrified at what she saw. Tom had carved a bunch of drawings into the wall with his fingernails. The drawings were satanic. The freakiest part? Tom had written, "He's coming," on the wall, in his blood. Who's coming? The devil, clearly, so get out of there.
Dead Person Hospital, a creepy abandoned mental asylum riddled with ghosts. Give number 2 your best smile is the Sai Ying Pun Psychiatric Hospital in Hong Kong. This hospital was the sole asylum in Hong Kong between 1947 and 1961. The building was later abandoned in the 1970s, however it seems a number of ghostly spirits were left behind. Supernatural spirit hunters have reported mysterious footsteps and sounds of a woman wailing. Worst of all though, some people who have been unlucky enough to be in the building at night have reported visions of an evil man bursting into flames, whilst other reports seeing decapitated ghosts just stalking the halls at night. The most scary and haunted hospital in the world has also been the spot of many murders and suicides.
And number 2 is the Kuhn Memorial State Hospital. So the history of this hospital starts back in 1830. It was the Vicksburg, Mississippi hospital treating patients mainly diagnosed with smallpox. The hospital also served the wounded during the Civil War. It officially closed its doors in 1989, and although the new owners boarded up the property in the early 90s, trespassers quickly made their way into the buildings. Paranormal investigation groups have reported seeing full-body apparitions and shadow figures roaming the building. They say you feel the presence of the past patients of the building as well. Many visitors also say they have heard the usual bangs, bumps, and footsteps commonly heard in spirited destinations. It is also known far and wide as a hotspot for paranormal activity, with groups that investigate apparitions and EVPs recorded there. While one group group of ghost hunters were exploring the abandoned Coon Memorial State Hospital, they found the body of a missing woman.
Now at number 2 is Coon Memorial Hospital. This has to be one of Mississippi's most haunted buildings for sure. The hospital was open for well over a century before being closed down in 1989. When it initially opened, it was for the smallpox outbreak, but later tended to Civil War soldiers, and then later the yellow fever outbreak. Well, we have a lot of outbreaks as a species, don't we? The hospital itself is a maze of rooms and walls. Some are knocked down, most are spray painted, it's just a whole mess. And despite being abandoned pretty much right after it closed, many paranormal teams have been inside and have seen shadow figures climbing up the walls. Yes, up the walls, and not just floating around the hallways, up the walls. Their cameras captured disembodied voices saying, "Oh my god," and the voice of a little girl saying, "Want to come play with me? Why do dead kids always want to play? I don't want to play with you, like leave me alone." The worst discovery happened in 2015 where a group of ghost hunters ventured into the hospital to check it out. You know, adrenaline junkies, I don't know, I don't get it. Now they ended up finding the murdered body of a missing woman near the entrance, but her blood trails indicated she had come from inside. Her body had been dragged from the second floor in the middle of the hospital to a grassy area outside. Most of her blood was found on the steps. I just need a minute to comprehend this.
In our second spot, we have Athens Lunatic Asylum. Yes, that's the actual name of this asylum. Located in Athens, Ohio, the asylum was built in 1874 for patients with tuberculosis. However, over the years, it became way too overcrowded and understaffed. As a result, patients were being mistreated. Over the years, the hospital turned into a place for the mentally ill. This is when the man, Dr. Walter Jackson, comes into play. Dr. Jackson loved transorbital lobotomies. He believed that it could cure all mental illnesses. So at this hospital, he performed 200 lobotomies. I'm telling you right now that many did not go so well. But that's not the only freaky thing to happen there. A patient known as Margaret Schilling went missing while in the ward. A month later, her body was found locked in a room in an abandoned section of a ward. In fact, her decaying body left a nasty stain on the ward's floor that can still be seen today.
But let's go on to number 2, Letchworth Village. Letchworth Village was a residential institution that opened in 1911. Now it is overtaken by nature, as it has been just left to be. People who walk among the buildings report feeling overwhelming sadness. Visitors also report hearing furniture scraping across floors in the buildings, heavy footsteps, disembodied whispers, and tapping, knocking, and rapping on the peeling stained walls. So similar to other paranormal places, there are rooms that become suddenly cold, but there is just so much paranormal activity at Letchworth. There are possible poltergeists that fling belongings and turn lights on and off, plus people record a lot of EVP phenomena. Now the scariest thing a group reported was that they came across a 7-foot tall apparition with its legs bent back. It stalked towards them with glowing white eyes. If I saw that, I don't know what I would do, probably run away very quickly. And others have felt pushed, shoved, or held down by mysterious forces while exploring, so if you decide to check it out, be warned. There's a lot.
Finally, at number 1, a disgusting and scary urban legend that turns out to be true. Coming into number 1, we have Chinese hospitals sell dead babies to eat. What is this? The rumor was that a number of hospitals in China were selling aborted child fetuses, as Chinese people believed that eating them would boost their stamina and sexual health. This, unfortunately, is the truth. This was happening. It was even reported that surgeons were eating the fetuses themselves. Now in 2011, South Korean customs seized 17,000 pills containing powdered baby flesh that had been smuggled in from China. There was a documentary made about the practice that aired in South Korea that showed doctors refrigerating dead babies. The undercover reporter learned that corrupt medics at hospitals were selling the dead babies on to paying customers who wanted to eat them for their health. One anonymous consumer even said that he'd cook the fetuses in a soup with ginger and orange peel. How disgusting is that?
At number 2, we have a C-section nightmare. It comes from P as in Peter on Reddit, who had a traumatizing experience while getting a C-section. She said that when the doctors were preparing to close her, she had blood splash on her face. Her own blood. She wrote that one of the doctors working on her must have dropped one of her organs. Like, hello? This woman was simultaneously giving life and being reminded that hers is fragile. She at least had a good attitude about it, because she said her family got their money's worth from the anesthesiologist who wiped the blood from her face and glasses. But that's an organ falling and splash. I don't know how they are not super traumatized by this, but that's the miracle of life, ladies and gentlemen. At number 2, teacher. So as a pharmacy tech, one of this person's job was to dispense patients' medications. As a 5'2" woman, just like me, she was accompanied by either a male nurse or a security guard. That was for safety reasons. But other than a death grip on her arm or a manic outburst every once in a while, she didn't face many issues. There was one 9-year-old boy who was always polite to her and found something to compliment about her every single time they met. He was also well-spoken and nice, so she began to look forward to saying hi to him, and that was until other female nurses saw. They asked if she was out of her mind. Apparently, when he was in kindergarten, he grew very attached to his young female teacher. He began calling her mom and left notes saying he wished he was her son. His home life was normal, and the teacher said she couldn't be his mom because that would hurt his real mom's feelings. He already had a good mom. So he went home and killed his own mother in her sleep by cutting her throat. And this was all so his teacher could be his mom. The female staff at the hospital then, after knowing that story, had a general rule of not interacting with him too much to prevent any kind of attachment from forming.
In our second spot, we have the bones. Just when you thought this list couldn't get any darker, we got this story. Literally, I was scripting this while eating mac and cheese and wrong decision. Stop eating. So this next patient had a tendency to harm himself. In particular, his habit was to break his own bones. Now, you would think that would be extremely painful, but for some reason, to him, it wasn't. In fact, he has broken his left arm more than 3 times over the years. Basically, as soon as it heals, he purposely breaks it again. And as a result, his left arm barely functions. When asked why he does this, he told the workers he loves the sounds of bones breaking. He also always has broken fingers and toes. He's just constantly snapping and breaking his bones. Now they have restrained him so that he can't harm himself. But still, I could never imagine breaking my own bones on purpose. It's like the scene in The Orphan when she like puts her arm in the if you see that movie, you know what I'm talking about.
At number 1, we have King's Seat Psychiatric Hospital in New Zealand. Now this hospital was opened up in 1932 and shut down in 1999. The King's Seat Hospital was not a nice place to be when it was opened, and seemingly is even worse now it's closed. The maximum security psychiatric unit was very intense, and you can still see the bars that were placed on the window as well as the scratch marks in the walls from where patients were clawing to get out. Local legend has it that more nurses died at the facility than patients. Since the hospital's closure in the 90s, several death cases have been reported and investigated as manslaughter or murder amid repeated claims of abuse. Some said that staff even beat several patients to death or just simply let others starve. There have been over 100 ghost sightings in the building, which has been the subject of many paranormal investigations over the years. Many people believe that the hospital is haunted by the Grey Nurse. Others report seeing a number of shadows. Now it might not all be bad. A family that lives nearby has claimed that ghosts play with their children and they're quite friendly. Creepy though. Very creepy.
Lastly, number 1, Oklahoma Tuberculosis Sanatorium. The Eastern Oklahoma Tuberculosis Sanatorium was built in 1921 to care for patients with the disease. It was closed down in 1975 from a declining need for the facility, in part due to the new advancements in treatments. It is believed to be haunted by the spirits of the children who died while being treated. One Native American woman who was admitted to the sanatorium as a teenager lost many of her friends there. She remembers a moment when the janitor there, who also worked as a gravedigger, pointed to her and asked, "When will I be coming to you?" Also, during author Cheryl Pearson's research on the history of the sanatorium, she found out very disturbing information. Native American children used to be tested on for cures to tuberculosis at this hospital, most likely so cures for white children could be found. Those children who were tested on are believed to be the ones who haunt the abandoned ruins to this day.
And finally, at number 1 is Gonjiam Hospital. Located in South Korea, it's said to be one of the most haunted buildings in the country. I mean, CNN even called it the freakiest place in the world. The hospital was randomly and abruptly closed in the 1990s, and people only really found out why ages afterwards. They weren't making money, the conditions were beyond unsanitary, there was no proper sewage disposal, and worst of all, a lot of the doctors themselves were mentally ill and the patients were murderous. All in all, it's just not a good mix. The story goes that patients and staff alike would randomly die without cause and would later be found at their desks or in their beds. It said a doctor on the staff was mentally ill and he was the one killing everyone inside. The bad juju they left behind was so bad that visitors who go in there have come out screaming after hearing moans and seeing shadows and being scratched by nails that aren't even there.
And in our our number 1 spot, we have Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Located in Kentucky, this hospital was originally built in 1910 as a hospital for patients with tuberculosis. Sadly, tons of patients ended up dying from the disease. The hospital did more harm than good. Rumor goes that the hospital was mistreating their patients and conducting experiments on them. In fact, they had an area in the hospital called the death tunnel or body chute where they would dump the deceased. It's also said that one nurse hung herself in room 502, and in that same room another nurse died from falling out of the window. The hospital closed in 1961 upon the discovery of an antibiotic that could treat and cure tuberculosis. As a result, there was no need for the hospital. Now it's said that it's an extremely haunted building. Apparently, people have seen tons of apparitions there. The most famous one being of a boy named Timmy, who likes to play with rubber balls. He also likes to run from room to room. It's said that if you roll a small ball down a hallway, then Timmy will roll it back to you. Also, why are all ghosts either named like Timmy or Tommy? That's what I need to know.
But let's go on to our number 1, Poveglia Island. So this island is known for a lot of supernatural happenings, but there was a large mental hospital on the island that ran from 1922 to 1968. There's a legend that one mental health doctor there tortured, butchered, and ate many of the patients. Now, this is allegedly before he went mad and jumped to his death from the bell tower, but I would argue that he was probably mad before that if he was eating patients. Now, the legend states that it wasn't the fall that actually killed him when he jumped from the tower, but a mist that came up from the ground and strangled him. Now, the ruins of the hospital remain on the island to this day, but it is now illegal to step foot on the island. This is due to the number of haunted happenings that go on there. Now, there's said to be many plague spirits on the island from the number of bodies dumped there during the plague, as well as the spirits of those harmed by the doctor from the mental hospital. Alright, at number 10 we have a mass hallucination. This one was posted by a nurse that goes by RN_waitress on Reddit. During a 2012 outbreak of fungal meningitis, the acute care floor she was working on had at least 10 to 15 meningitis patients. The floor itself has a capacity of 20. Many of these meningitis patients were having the same hallucinations. The nurse wrote on Reddit that they experienced children in the corners of their rooms and auditory hallucinations of religious music. Now, if you think this was a prank being played by sick patients, then think again. All of the patients were in isolation with no shared rooms and no communication between one another. So what do you think caused it? Specific parts of the brain the fungal infection was affecting, or was it something else?
And last but not least, at our number 1 spot is The Repetition. Now this one's from Redditor Cam Brewer, who was a 4th year nursing student when this happened to them. She was sitting for a 28-year-old woman who was going through alcohol withdrawal, and it was the 3rd day, which is scientifically the worst. And sitting is basically when you sit by a patient that could be dangerous to themselves or others, and this woman was fully restrained, like hands and feet were bound to the bed. She was shouting racial slurs at the nurse and spitting on her, and after a while started straight up hallucinating. She thought she was in her car driving with her 2 kids in the back, and she kept begging the nurse to take the wheel. She then explained the car crash in vivid detail, saying that her son had died. She kept crying and apologizing and repeatedly kept asking the nurse to hand her the body of her dead son. She was sedated, and when that wore off, the same hallucinations happened again. The same scenario happened 8 times in this woman's 12-hour shift, and after hearing it enough times, she realized it wasn't a hallucination at all. This was something that she had actually done, but was replaying in her mind in her delirious state. Can you imagine being so delirious that like you're hallucinating a car crash where you killed your 7-year-old son, but it's not hallucination, it's real? Nope.
At number 1 is Cockroach. So this one is not for the faint of heart, just warning you. One person's dad told them a story of a time he pulled a cockroach out of someone's tongue. What the doctors assume happened is that the patient ate roach eggs along with something else that cut their tongue. This unique situation let the egg embed itself in the tongue and hatch there. So the person was admitted with a horrible looking tongue that needed to be dissected so the doctor could take out a still squirming cockroach.
And in our number 1 spot, we have the eyes. Again, if you're eating something, maybe just put your food away. Just wait until this video's done. Believe me, you won't have an appetite after this. So this story was told by a daughter whose mom worked at a neuropsychiatric ward. One night while she was doing the room checks, she came across a very horrific scene. She turned the corner and saw that a staff member was collapsed on the floor. She immediately started doing CPR and called for help. The staff member had suffered a heart attack after seeing what the patient had done. The patient, who suffered from severe postpartum psychiatric disorder, was just sitting on the floor with her own eyes in her hand. Yeah, she gouged out her own eyes and was just holding them. And while the mom was frantically trying to save her co-worker's life, the patient just sat there calmly, smiling, holding her eyes.